What do you think of when you hear the word stretch? Or better yet, what comes to mind when you think of the act of stretching or performing a stretch? For most people, stretching isn't really done except when they're in pain, and I mean physical pain or discomfort, which could be anywhere from experiencing muscles in your body that are aching, maybe it's your lower back feeling tight after sitting for a while, or you're sore from a workout, or you're just experiencing this overall sense of stiffness throughout your body. And let me say right off the bat that stretching in these instances is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It's a good sign that your instincts are kicking in. Stretching is necessary and natural. If you watch animals, they do it all the time, but they do it differently than humans. And if you have a movement practice or a fitness routine that's well balanced and utilizing stretching techniques strategically, then you have a lower likelihood of experiencing these sensations or symptoms in your body. What you'll discover in this episode today is that the science behind stretching and how we can approach it and use it as a tool in our daily lives when you do find yourself in these situations has come a very long way. Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm Aly DiRoma, your host of Modern Body, this podcast, not to be confused with the online Pilates and movement platform called Modern Body that I run and where I teach Pilates and movement training. This podcast is designed to be a resource for you to learn more about your body, to understand that movement is really an essential part of our life and its impacts go much deeper than what you see on the surface. My goal with this podcast is to help you decipher the truths from the trends in the fitness industry, and more importantly, to give you a practical and realistic approach to how you can take the information you hear on this podcast and apply it into your own life. Today, we are talking all about stretching because there are so many different techniques of stretching. I'm going to use the word stretching today as the act of lengthening. So stretching, simply put, is when we're moving the two opposing points of muscular attachments away from one another, creating length. Those points being first, the origin, where the muscle starts, and second, the insertion, where it ends or attaches. What you'll learn in this episode is that we can stretch or influence the length of our muscles and tendons in many ways, but not all ways are going to be the most helpful in all instances. And today, you're going to walk away with an understanding of a few of the various techniques of stretching, what they are helpful for, and when you would choose to do one over the other, or why you would strategically implement them into certain points or timing throughout your training or your class. This episode is intended to really help you shift or broaden your perspective of how to view, approach, and implement elements of stretching into your life in a way that's going to bring about more lasting long-term effects and change in your body, rather than just using stretching as temporary relief, which is what most of us tend to do. I mention this because maybe you have experienced this in your past, where you have this tight kind of feeling in a muscle and you stretch it all the time. But it doesn't really feel like it's ever getting looser. But it gives this sense of relief temporarily while you're in the stretch. But afterward, nothing's really changed. And I'm also saying this from personal experience because I've been there before. And I wanted to dedicate an episode to stretching because with most of the topics I choose, it's because there's a lot of confusion about what stretching is, why we do it, how to do it, and how to do it in a way that's going to make the most impact on our bodies. What I've also noticed over the years is that most people have a tendency to skip stretching at the beginning or the ending of a class or workout they're doing because they're so focused on getting the actual calorie burning portion in of the workout that they don't see the warm up or the cool down portions as being as important as the middle section. But after today, you're going to find out that it truly is a very important aspect of our whole body health. It also seems most people, the only time when they're stretching, and I say seems because this is based off of experience working with many, many people, that they have a tendency to only want to stretch when they're in pain. But the thing is, even if we incorporate, 2 minutes of stretching, dynamic stretching would be a great example, at the beginning or at the ending of our class or workout, we can greatly reduce the amount of muscle soreness we might experience, joint stiffness. It can really help to prevent injury long term and promote a more efficient, smoother recovery process between our classes or training sessions. The key is, though, building this time into your workouts or classes strategically. And when you do that, you're going to feel such a big difference in your body during your training or after your training. Today, on the topic of stretching, I'm going to briefly touch upon 3 techniques of stretching and how they're effective, how they're impactful and beneficial to you, and also when to do them, because you don't want to do every type of stretching all the time. They need to be done in such a way that it's going to promote more benefit and, like I said earlier, lasting change in your body. Another word or a couple of words you're probably hearing often in this whole stretching world and industry and even fitness industry as a whole are the words mobility and fascial release. Today, I'm not going to be talking about mobility and fascial release. We're going to save those for another episode. Today, we're specifically going to talk about stretching, although you may, be scrolling through social media and see people say that they don't stretch, but they kind of really are stretching. They're just not calling it that because it's a different type of stretching, and that's what we're going to talk about today as well. The first stretching technique that I want to talk about today is one that is most familiar to people. Remember at the beginning of this episode where I asked you what you thought of when you thought of the act of stretching? What came to mind? For some of us, it may mean we're still practicing the type of stretching we learned from elementary school PE class. You know, the one where you would reach down and touch your toes, and then you would stop when you felt there was like a hurt or a tension or a pull through the back of your legs. I'm referencing the hamstrings here. And you would have to hold that position until your coach told you to relax, right? Or to stop. Well, this is a type of stretching, and it's very classic, and it's called static stretching. And it's more of an active static stretching because this is where you're going to reach into a position and hold it. You're creating length and elongation of the muscles, the muscle fibers and the tendons, and you're using some force from your legs and arms to create that stretch. This is a beneficial technique of training, but only when it's done in the right context. So you may have in the past learned to do a static stretch like this to warm up with. However, this is not the type of stretch that I would advise or is even researched as the best way to warm up. So the scenario in which this type of stretching would be best would be after you've done some initial movement and warming up. So you're not what we would say cold or just like walking straight into your class or your workout. So ideally you would do this maybe after a few mobilizing sequences. It could be very simple movements, but something to start to bring blood flow into your body, into those muscles, those tendons, and really loosen yourself up before you would approach this static stretch. So that was static active stretching. Now there's another type called static passive stretching. And this can also be beneficial in the right context. So this can either be done on your own, with a partner, or a PT or massage therapist. So basically when we are doing a passive static stretch, what's happening is that you are passively moving a body part into a range of motion while you yourself, the person being stretched, is relaxed. So that's the example of if a partner were doing it or a practitioner were doing it. Now, if you were doing it to yourself, so say for example, you are a dancer, and I'm just gonna reference that because that's my past experience. We did a lot of passive stretching. So we would regularly, before class, you would like go into your split and just like hold it for a while and just kind of relax there. This is also done in yoga a lot. So I know yin yoga does a lot of more passive stretching. And that's where you would sit maybe in pigeon pose and just kind of breathe and try to relax through your body and let yourself gradually sort of melt passively into the stretched position using your body weight and gravity forces to create that stretch. This can be, like I said, a beneficial type or technique of stretching, but done in small doses and depending on your body. So oftentimes people who are hypermobile, meaning they have a lot of mobility and length through their muscle fibers and tendons, they love this type of stretching because it comes so naturally and so easily to them. But this is kind of the opposite of what that person really needs. So with their constitution and their natural abilities, they would benefit more from a different type of stretching that we're going to get into a little bit later in the episode. And it's also good for people that aren't as mobile and want to create more mobility. However, again, what can happen is, we're told all the time that we're tight. Oh, we need to have more flexibility. We need to have longer muscle fibers. And what can happen though, if you're not careful, is that we can overcompensate and overstretch. And this is going to create excessive elongation through our muscles and tendons. This passive static stretching brings up a point I want to make, and that is more of a paradox that occurs in our body. Now, I'm saying this because it happens more often than you know. And when I first heard about it, it really made so much sense to me and completely changed the way I thought about stretching. Typically, there are two reasons why your muscles are feeling tight and like you want to stretch them out. It's either because A, they're too short, so too much tension, maybe they're too bound up or restricted, those muscle fibers are too close together, or they're too long. So we could call this excessive shortening, excessive lengthening. Every muscle in our body has a neutral zone of length that it ideally wants to live in. These ideal lengths or neutral zones of our muscle fibers and tendons sometimes can get thrown out of whack over time due to different factors of our lifestyle or stress or training, etc. Sometimes we use some muscle more than others and some less than others. So that's how we kind of get these, what we'll say is imbalances in our muscles and cause this lengthening, excessive lengthening or shortening. Some people are also genetically predispositioned to having more muscle fiber length, more laxity, and some have less. So this is highly individual, this paradox. Here is the paradox, and here's how you would know if maybe you're caught up in this cycle of this paradox happening to you. And this is what happened to me. So when you have an area or a muscle in particular you're trying to constantly stretch, but you seem to be getting no relief. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. This could be a sign that there is something going on in your body that we need to address. I'm going to use the example of your psoas because it's a very high profile muscle and I feel like it gets really beat up on a lot, and this is my personal experience as well with this paradox. Here's what would happen. I would stretch the shit out of this muscle, and guess what? It never felt relaxed or long. And that's because I was overstretching it. I was making this muscle so long that it was creating more tension in my body. So it was excessively being lengthened. To help you visualize this, think about a slinky, like a mini slinky that you're holding between your hands, and it's in that arced shape. Now, when we start to pull the slinky apart, we're pulling the origin away from the insertion. What's happening is that there is more tension being created into the slinky, right? And that's not a bad thing. Sure, muscles can lengthen, but if we go a little bit too far, it might almost feel like it's about to break, like we cannot stretch it anymore. So visualize your muscle being in that elongated position for a very long period of time. There is so much tension in that muscle that it gives the same effect as when you would push the slinky together to where there's no space between the coils anymore. There's so much tension that it feels exactly like a tight or an excessively shortened muscle. So overall, what we can be mindful of with these static stretches, both in the active and the passive, is that they aren't bad stretches to do. They just need to be done with a lot of intention, and they need to be done strategically, and they need to be done appropriately for the individual. This brings us to the second stretching technique, which is dynamic stretching, and it's one of my personal favorites. It involves moving parts of your body in a way that gradually moves your muscles and tendons through various lengths without holding any one specific length or position for any period of time. Dynamic stretching examples could be things like standing pelvic circles, they could be arm swings, or torso rotations. You'll move through these stretches, or more so movements, with much more ease than the previous stretches we talked about, and it will begin to make your body move into those end ranges of motion, but without force. This technique of stretching is so great because it brings blood flow into our muscles. It provides that warmth and heat we need to really get our bodies going, to really move it into more strenuous work safely. It provides time for our bodies to become primed, to build awareness into various joints or into our muscles even. And if you take one of my classes on Modern Body, you'll notice I do this type of stretching often. Definitely at the beginning in our entry of class, in our warm-up, and also in the cool down and exit phase of class, because it really helps also your nervous system start to enter into the work and come out of the work in a way that is gradual. Dynamic stretching like this also helps to avoid overstretching. As I mentioned earlier, if you're someone who is not as flexible, or you don't consider yourself a flexible person or a mobile person, this will really help to gradually bring more mobility into an area before you deepen the stretch or go further with the exercise that you're doing. How I use dynamic stretches in more than just a warm-up and a cool down is that I will typically start with a dynamic stretch or a movement. And once I feel that our body is prepared and primed and ready for a more held stretch, a more static active stretch, then maybe on the last repetition, I would have us hold the position for a few extra breaths. So that is a great example of how I would use a dynamic stretch and a static stretch within a class in a way that's strategically layered that would bring the most beneficial impact to our body and bring about those lasting changes that we're wanting to create. Here's another place I want to plug something I've noticed online. Oftentimes, as I'm scrolling, I will come across people who say that they don't stretch. But what I want to point out is that what they really mean is they're not doing those static stretches we talked about earlier. And more likely what they're doing are these dynamic stretches where they're moving through a range of motion throughout their muscles, throughout their joints. And they could also be referencing fascial work that they're doing. They could also be referencing mobility work that they're doing. So chances are they probably are layering in elements of stretch and stretch technique, but they're not calling it that. So they're saying that they don't stretch. But as we're learning, stretching is very multifaceted, multi-layered, and there's many ways to do it. The last type of stretching that we're going to talk about today, which is very helpful and valuable, is PNF stretching. Now, this is short for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. We have not talked about this today, but your nervous system is highly involved in the stretching sensation or function in your body, because your nervous system is signaling to your body, or your body signaling to your brain, that certain ranges of motion are safe and some are not safe for you. So PNF stretching incorporates the nervous system a lot more too, and helps you to create length through these muscles in a safe way. So the example of PNF stretching, well, first of all, let me tell you the technique behind it. It is a combination of using a passive stretch and an isometric stretch at the same time. So the example we'll use is laying on your back. You want to stretch out your hamstring. Typically what you would do is take your arms and reach and grab your leg, right? And try to just pull it towards you. Well, that would be an example of a passive stretch, because you're using your arms to just pull and you're trying to relax the back of your leg. But where the dynamic stretch comes in here is that what you're going to do simultaneously with the pulling of your arms is that the leg that you're holding onto, you're going to press it out into your hand. So there's going to be like this push-pull action that's happening. So you would do that stretch for a period of time, not very long, and then you would release it. And you'd want to release it for about 20 seconds and then repeat that stretch again. There's an activation in the stretch and then a release. Now, technically they're saying an isometric stretch because your muscle fibers are not changing in length when you're doing the stretch because your leg's going to stay in the same position. But those muscle fibers are lengthening, or those tendons are lengthening, because what you'll notice is that each repetition of this type of PNF stretching you're doing, your ability to bring your leg closer to your body is going to gradually increase. And then once you've done, say, 5 of these repetitions of this PNF stretch for your hamstring is going to feel longer and looser. Now, like I said, I do want you to remember here that at the beginning I said all of these techniques of stretching are beneficial and valuable, but what is super important here is when you're doing these stretches, the timing of these stretches within the course of your class that day or your workout or your training. PNF stretching is a highly effective form of stretching, but research has shown that if you do PNF stretching prior to an exercise, especially something that requires jumping or fast twitch muscle fibers to turn on, that PNF stretching like this will actually decrease the performance of the muscle fibers in their strength and their power. So it's best to do these PNF stretches at the end of your workout rather than the beginning. All right, now let's do a quick recap. So the first type of stretching we talked about was static stretching, and there were 2 types. There was the active static stretching and the passive static stretching. The example of the active stretching was where perhaps you're sitting on the ground, you want to reach forward and touch your toes to stretch out the backs of your legs. Well, it's active because you are using your arms as a force to pull you down into the stretch, and you're also going to reach your legs out simultaneously. So you're active throughout this process. Then the example of the passive stretch was where maybe somebody else is moving your body and you are relaxed and they're moving your body into different ranges of motion, or you are kind of sitting in a position or holding in a position and trying to relax. So that would be more passive static. And remember, these are both good types of stretches, but they're typically not going to be the best stretches to do at the beginning of a class. This is the type of stretching that you want to layer in more strategically after you've warmed up. The second type of stretch was the dynamic stretching. This is the type of stretching that is not forced. This is the type of stretching that will feel like you're doing movement. So it could be those standing hip circles, it could be the torso rotations, the arm circles. So it's never held. So you're never going to be holding a range of motion. You're going to be moving through all of them. And this one is really great for warming up with, for gently bringing blood flow and mobility and awareness and really priming your body for the next layer of work that you want to do. The third type of stretching was the PNF stretching, and that stood for the proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. This is the type of stretching where you're going to simultaneously have this push-pull sensation that you can do through your own body, or someone else could do it for you. And it's also a highly effective type of stretching, but this is again one you want to strategically do near the end of your workout or after you've worked a certain muscle group, because if you do it at the beginning, it may decrease the strength and power of those specific muscles that you're wanting to work. The example we used was jumping, those fast twitch muscle fibers. We want them to be primed, and PNF stretching would actually decrease their performance. Okay, so I think that's enough information for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you were able to broaden your perspective of what stretching is, gain a better understanding of how stretching can be implemented into your daily life, how you're now seeing it within the structure of your classes, and how it can be most beneficial to you to create more lasting long-term change in your body rather than just that temporary relief. It's also something I want to point out that when it's layered within classes or within training, again, strategically and with intention, it can be so beneficial to your body in the long run, so you don't feel like you're constantly like having to stretch your body out tight. And a little goes a long way when it's done well. Thank you so much again for joining me this week. If you want to learn more about Modern Body and the classes that we offer there, then you can go to modernbody.io to find out more. You can also go find me on Instagram if you want to. My handle is @Aly DiRoma. You can send me a message there. We can chat. And if you did enjoy today's episode, it would be so wonderful if you could just take 1 minute, leave a rating, leave a review, and or maybe even send this to someone you think could benefit from the information. So that's all for this week. I will be here next week with a new episode for you. Bye.